So I thought that this particular concept, okay, so first of all, to kind of position this, as I listened to the talks today, we have sort of this broad, well-established approach to intercultural communication, to the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, and we have Inez's development of the 5 languages and applying that to an intercultural environment. And then we have Father Paolo's very deep and serious work in working with refugees. And so then I started thinking, well, this is pretty minor compared to that. But so just to kind of position it for you, I think of this as a tool. And so like with any tool in our toolkit, if you have a hammer, everything is not a nail. So everything is not about social indexicality. I don't see this as the answer to everything, but I do see it as one powerful analytic tool that works in a number of contexts. So recognizing when those contexts, where it might apply in those contexts. I'm talking about applying this concept of social indexicality in understanding contested intercultural interactions. Now, social indexicality is not just about contestation. It's not just about disagreement. But when there are disagreements, it's oftentimes a tool that helps people in doing an analysis. And I find it useful in my own research, in my analysis, and I find it useful in my teaching with undergraduates in particular, helping them understand that it's not always just a difference of opinion, that oftentimes these differences of opinion are grounded in political history, they're grounded in economic circumstances, and that there are more dominant interpretations that might have a reason to be contested or to be resisted by certain folks. So what I'm going to try to do, and of course I also thank you all for dealing with English at 4 o'clock in the afternoon after many days. So.
No problem.
Thank you. And so Melvin's going to interpret what I mean. So I'm going to present this from a number of different examples, and see if it works for you, and see what you have to say about it. So I need to slow down. That caffeine is just a little too much. Okay. So what did you get? My name's Melissa. Social indexicality. And
I got everything, but
it's a tool. It's a tool. Okay.
And the nail I also got.
Okay. So in 2004, this is one of my examples. In 2004, sorry this comes too dark. It doesn't come dark on mine at all. But
because of the light.
Turn off this light.
The front light.
It's a the compromise we need to make is then if we turn it off, then she won't come on the camera.
Okay. So it's up to you. So just let me know when you can't see something and if you want to adjust the lights at that point. So in 2004, there was a controversy in China. Well, actually, it was covered in the world news, the world business news, where China banned a Nike ad. And it was featuring LeBron James, who was an up-and-coming, very successful NBA basketball player who was very popular in Cleveland. And NBA basketball was becoming more and more popular in China. And Nike really saw this as a way in to strengthen their market. They were already in the market. And it was banned. And some of the issues that came through, I feel that social indexicality is one powerful tool that would help people to understand what went wrong with this particular ad. So this made international news, and it was the news story was you could read it in the you can read it in South China Post, Morning Post. You could read it in the Guardian. You could read it in U.S. Newspapers, in The Economist, and you saw a very common theme throughout it. You know, you get usually a general story that then goes out to all of these media outlets, and it gets tweaked a little bit. But, so there were some common themes.
What does it say, Dan?
Okay, so this is LeBron James in Chamber of Fear. And I'm going to actually give you some details about it as we go through. So here in the ad, it was set up like a video game setting. And he's working his way through 5 rooms in the video game setting. And he's called the Chosen One. And he's facing his fears. So each room was a fear, a foe, and he defeats that foe, and it's done in a basketball court kind of environment. So the first fear or foe was hype, which I don't know how to translate that into Portuguese. Is this work?
Yeah.
Okay. So Google Translate worked for me.
Yeah.
Okay. I figured you'd know the other ones, but hype.
Yeah.
The next one was temptation. The next one was envy. Then complacency, being too laid back about it. And then the other one was the big one, self-doubt. And as we went through that, there was an intended message, according to both LeBron James and to Frank Bond, who was Nike's marketing director, that the message was for players to overcome their internal fears, their internal obstacles about that they can improve themselves. And from LeBron James's perspective, the style, it was video game, but it was also based on Bruce Lee films. So he was, it's not unusual, it was very common for young African-American men for martial arts films, Chinese, Hong Kong martial arts films to be very popular. So he identified with this, and he really thought that this was bringing together kind of two cultural environments together, emerging this together, synthesizing it, and encouraging young kids to overcome their own internal fears and obstacles in being successful. And he himself had come through many obstacles. Poverty, a single mother, bordering on homelessness himself. And so he really saw this as a nice kind of way to synergize it, to synthesize it and bring it together. And he said it wasn't intended to hurt anybody or any culture or anything like that. We put the ads together basically for kids. And as Frank Pan said, it's for people to improve themselves. The other side was that the message that was taken up in watching the ad was that it was blaspheming national practices and culture. You haven't seen why yet. I'll show you why. That was the interpretation. And it violated the regulation on advertising that they must uphold the national dignity and the interest of the country and respect the motherland's culture. And it wasn't just a governmental evaluation, that there were many indignant responses from Chinese viewers and blog posts, particularly by young folks themselves. So the state administration for radio, film, and TV said that it was offensive to the nation's dignity, and so it was banned. And Nike pulled it, and they apologized. But in their apologizing, Frank Kahn says, in China there are 1.3 billion people. So some people are going to have different opinions. And we were encouraging the idea that players can overcome their fears to improve themselves. We believe that the approach is very Asia-centric. So it's an apology, but it's an apology that's not really showing an understanding of where things went wrong, or an acknowledgement of that. In the Western news reports, the ones that I read about, a dozen different ones, and the Western news reports, every one of them said it was banned, but the statement doesn't say why it was offensive. Now, they said it offended dignity, they said national dignity, the motherland's culture, didn't respect it, but they're saying it didn't tell us why. So I think that using this concept of social indexicality in relationship to context will help us to see why it was seen as not creative borrowing, but as inappropriate borrowing of cultural symbols, of Chinese cultural symbols. And that this can give us a powerful tool for analyzing conflict. Now, before we can get to that, I have to talk about social indexicality. And before we talk about social indexicality, I have to talk about referential indexicality. So bear with me a little bit while I build these concepts, and then we'll show the application. We'll come back to this and show the application. So indexicality in general, it comes from linguistics, the idea of linguistics. And in English, sorry, my Portuguese. I have about 3 words now, which is slow since I've been here for 5 days. But this is the index finger, right? And with the index finger, we point. So if we think about indexicality is a pointing to something. And so it points to a concept or an idea. But also it's very much dependent upon context. So referential indexicality means the reference is in the word itself and it's in the context. So the examples, these are in linguistics, these are oftentimes called shifters because the meaning shifts according to context. So, for example, if I'm saying to you, yesterday my friend texted me and said, okay, now I'm going to tell you how to get here. Well, now, meant yesterday, right? At that moment yesterday. I'm saying that word, but it doesn't mean this I, it means my friend. And you doesn't mean you, it means this you, me. And here doesn't mean here, it means his house. So we see here this carries over to social indexicality in that we see the meaning is extremely dependent upon context. And we have to have a sensitive understanding of context to understand the meaning itself. And it can shift. Okay? Now, the difference between social indexicality and referential indexicality is that social indexicality, the meaning is not in the words. So if I say the word chair, the meaning is in that word, chair itself. So we're going to see that it relates to language and other things where it's pointing to meaning and context, but it's not contained by a person saying that is a chair. Let me see if I can explain that quickly. Okay, so social indexicality points to social identities and social qualities. So I don't say, oh, you're very beautiful, okay? That's, the meaning is referential then, right? You and beautiful, that's referential. But I'm doing things that I'm pointing to identities and to qualities. So we see this in media a lot. In the 1930s, there was a big burgeoning of explosion of cowboy movies, Western cowboy movies in the States. And the good guy always had the white hat, the bad guy always had the black hat. Now the good guy didn't come onto the stage and say, I'm the good cowboy, right? You didn't have to. The white hat was the social indexicality. It said cowboy, identity, and quality, good. The black hat, bad person, cowboy, bad person. Okay. We see this social indexicality working. It's not just in language, it can be in clothing, color, but also, depending on social, historical hierarchies and context, it can be skin color, it can be our physical features, our facial features, our clothing, our shoes, and the use of media, for example, of animal features. So what are some common things that you see here that are working as indexicals?
The names, the Russian names.
Okay, yes.
Eyebrows.
Right. So the Russian names, and what is this saying?
Russian
You're bad.
people.
Yeah, bad person, right? Now it doesn't say Boris, I am bad, right?
Uh-huh.
So there's an indexicality just in those names in the U.S. context
What?
when we were growing up, when I was growing up in the cartoons.
I noticed that the person that Rocky was fighting against, depending on the year, right?
Yeah. And so it's a historical context, right? Political, geopolitical relations, the Cold War, for example. Okay, and someone mentioned mustache, right? So the mustache, again, it's style, certain style of a mustache. What else? And again, eyebrows, right? What else do you notice?
Face expression.
They smiling.
Yes, the smiles, the teeth size, the kind of smile, the teeth size, the hands,
Eyes.
the eyes. What else? Very common, right? Very common. In the U.S. media, anyway, that a hook nose, a large hook nose would, and you still see it in Disney films, for example. and oftentimes a darker skin complexion. Now, social indexicality isn't always negative, right? So, well, even the positive may be seen as something to criticize or to be critical of. But so up in the upper right-hand corner, what do we see? Yeah, so it's a girl, right? So that's the identity. It's a girl. It's a sweet girl. Why is she sweet? Her expression.
And clothes.
She's pink.
Yeah.
Right? What else?
The flower.
The flower.
So there's also a relationship with the age, so that's she is a child, the innocence, and so with the concept of childhood.
Purity, right. Now, and then there's some things that sometimes we don't want to go there with, but in the U.S. context, the fact that she's white and that she's blonde and has light-colored hair, that all comes together to index purity and innocence. Whether we're selling soap or a bicycle or a toy or whatever. And people grow up in these environments and are very aware of them. So that doesn't mean that we always agree with it, right? So we don't always agree that if somebody has a nose that looks like this, that they're a bad person, right? Or that if they have a black cowboy hat, that they're a bad person. And the meaning can change over time. I had to go back to find this kind of indexicality, because black hat now is kind of cool. But so we may not agree with it, but we are aware of the dominant social indexicality. We're aware of the common readings, even if we don't agree with them. But we're also influenced by those oftentimes, and oftentimes we're not aware of the degree to which we're influenced. Okay, you all get the name.
Yeah, the blonde and white one is interesting because even in Brazil, where we have a large part of the colored population, in TV advertisement, people are white
Yeah.
and blonde preferred.
Yeah. I remember, you said you're 60, so I can tell my age. I'm 59. So I can remember the first time I saw an African-American kid in an advertisement on TV growing up. Now, part of it is because I grew up in the rural Northeast in Vermont, and we had a very small TV station out of Maine where there were very few people of color. But it was a national, it was ABC. And I can remember the first time. It was, and then if you think about people of color in the U.S. context, sorry to use the U.S. so much, but when you think about people of color in the U.S. context, how they grow up with this, that's the norm, right? And of course, this has been challenged a lot in the last 30 years in the U.S. context, but also we need to know the social, historical, political, economic context wherever we go to really understand what the indexicality and social indexicality is.
Lisa, are you going back to the Chinese?
Yes.
Oh,
So I'm going to, yeah, sorry. First I need to do the concepts,
okay.
and then I'll apply it into the kind of other
Okay.
examples, and then I'll bring it back. Okay, so we see this very commonly in media. So this is why I'm saying it's such a powerful tool, analytical tool. We have language. It could be just what the language is. Is it Russian? Is it German? Is it Arabic?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it Arabic accented English, for example? And then, so the accent, the physical features, the way of dressing indexes both the identities, the character type, and will also oftentimes index place, time, other concepts. And these are based on stereotypes, abstractions, generalizations, right? And in media, it's seen as a necessary shortcut, right? You can't take 30 minutes to establish this character. You have to see it quickly. In a movie, for example. But there are consequences. Yes. One consequence is that it builds alliances. Indexicality will build alliances, but also builds boundaries, group boundaries. You belong here, you belong here. So these can be boundaries around all kinds of identities or qualities. Okay, so you've got it. Social indexicality points to identities and qualities without specifically saying it. These identities can be of all kinds of types: ethnic, social class, region, national, gender, age, etc. Any kind of a range of qualities. It's a social, cultural meaning that's not in the words or the images, but it's socially constructed. And it connects with context. Now, there's different levels of context to talk about here, but a couple that we'll talk about, and again, this is coming from linguistic anthropology, but I'm talking about indexicality has two main kinds of contexts that are at work. One is this presupposed context, or already established context, where there's some sharing. So when I came in here today, I knew, well, it's Ciatar Brazil, so I knew that there's certain types of context, but I didn't know how everything would play out. I didn't know how formal it would be, I didn't know how informal, I didn't know about English, I didn't know about being an outsider, all of these things. So there's also a creativity that goes on in the interaction. And oftentimes, another feature is that we're oftentimes not aware of all aspects. We usually only have partial awareness, partial understanding of what's being indexed and also of the impact of that. So this gets back to that idea that Milton was talking about, that we can't have encyclopedic knowledge. We can't know everything, right? But if we can be aware that this is such a powerful social phenomenon, we can be aware that in its context-driven, we can be aware that, well, we probably don't understand everything about why the Nike ad was offensive. And then it can help us to want to go and explore, to understand, to find out, and use that as a tool. So I'm going to use some other examples that aren't yet the Nike ad, but I promise to get back to that.
Okay.
Oops, sorry.
Cuenta iris.
Okay, so again, sorry to use a U.S. example, but how many folks, okay, so if we talk about the Southern accent, again, still building on media, but it doesn't have to be media related. In U.S. media, a Southern, like films, for example, a Southern accent is often meant to index something. Do you have a sense of that?
No, sorry.
Pardon
Can
me?
you repeat? Can you repeat?
Yes, so in the U.S. context, oftentimes in media, say in a film, they'll use a Southern accent a Southern U.S. accent to index something. So most immediately, it's a Southern identity of some sort, right? But what qualities? Do you have a sense of that?
No.
Backward.
Lazy.
Backwards, lazy,
Republican.
Republican, conservative, maybe
That would be redundant.
Racist.
racist. Okay, so we quickly, and see, it's, if we use Hollywood examples, of course, it comes, many people are exposed to that. And so we're aware of that. And so we're very quickly aware of many of the negative qualities that are immediately indexed by, well, I don't know about that. You know, it's like, And then if it's actually been a problem for politicians, on the not at the local level, because at the local level it's seen as warm and sociable, hospitable, gracious, but at the national level, that dominant indexicality kicks in. And you hear this politician, you think, wow, he's got to be so dumb. And then you realize, I am so influenced by this dominant social indexable reading. And I shouldn't be. I should know better than that. So I have to catch myself. Even though I work partly as a sociolinguist, I'm still influenced by this. So I have to, because it's such a gut, quick, you're so socialized into it. I got that. Okay, so there are also positive ones, right? Sociable, hospitable, a lot of manners, spiritual. We'll see that. And we may agree with them, or we may disagree with them, but we're still aware of the dominant readings that are there. And people who disagree are very aware of those dominant readings.
You're touching on a point that I love to talk about is awareness is conscience.
Yeah.
So you did catch yourself thinking, and you immediately you realized that you were being influenced.
Yeah.
But you did that step, so you did the awareness step. And how do you stimulate people, teach people,
Yeah, right.
lead them to that? And you should do that constantly, because you can lead them to 5 minutes moment, but you have to do that constantly.
This connects with today's conversations. Is how do we get from minimization, denial to minimization to sort of starting to accept? How do we get to the 5 languages? A woman I worked with at the University of Wisconsin in Madison talks about speaking into the listening.
Mm-hmm.
So find where they are, which works well with Milton's DMIS. Find where they are, and then try to bring them along from that. So first they get a sense that you're hearing them, and then you find out where they are, and then you can start moving them along. Oftentimes it has to do with finding an experience or an example that they can relate to. Age, and oftentimes it has to do with a safer topic like age is seen as a safer topic. Sometimes it's language. Like, oh, what is the romantic language? French or Italian or something. And then a woman in my class would say, it's German! My boyfriend is German! And everybody else, those are safer topics. And then you can go into these other more delicate topics that people are less comfortable with, that are building those fortress borders. Okay, so the I'm sorry?
Well, I suppose you could say that everything is like this, right? Whatever it is, whatever word, whatever tone, whatever, whatever is indexing. We have some meaning that we attach to it. We put it into a context, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to your the field, and sorry, I'm forgetting the figure ground stuff of what is part of the figure versus what's part of the ground.
Yeah,
So the shoes might be indexing more than the tie, or the haircut, or the eye color, or the accent, or whatever. So it depends on context.
So these are things that at least through media, or media is picking up on the fact that we pay attention to this.
Exactly.
And that we ought to know that
Right.
we pay attention to this, and therefore other people should know that we pay attention to this too.
Yeah, and it's kind of co-constructing, right? So they're picking up on social cues, but they're also establishing social cues and dominant messages themselves. Now, of course, there's related to this is the idea of multi-indexicality. It's not simple and straightforward always, right? So we quickly came up with some of the negative indexicals of a U.S. Southern accent. But depending on who you are, so it has to do with your position, right? Who you are and what your position is and what your perspective is. So someone from the South, there's this well-known documentary called American Tongues, someone from the South saying, they don't say honey, they don't say y'all, they're so cold. They're not polite at all, they're not warm. It's like, honey, come on over here and sit down, let's talk about this. And they're talking about the Southern accent is so warm and hospitable and open and welcoming, whereas that Northern accent is so cold and harsh. So it really depends on a person's position how they are doing the indexable reading. But those Southerners are still aware of the dominant negative indexicality of that accent. So have I got you still?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so we can look at, there's this indexicality of identities and qualities, but it depends on whose perspective. But this is wrapped up in some level of relations of power, history, politics, economics, etc. And hierarchies. That doesn't mean those hierarchies are absolute, totally inflexible, but they are dominant, strong, powerful hierarchies. Okay, I'm totally going to take a gamble here. Do you know this film? Oh, well, let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
You tell me how to say it.
Saudade.
Saudade de futuro. And Michael and I were watching this the other night, and I said, we have to figure out what this word means. Because we're
Oh, it's
not.
impossible to translate.
Right, right, so, yeah.
Saudade is the feeling of missing something.
Yeah, nostalgia.
And Portuguese is the only language in the world that has a word
That
for
captures
that
this.
captures the feeling.
Right, totally. Okay. So, we were watching this film. Unfortunately, we didn't get it finished watching it before we sorry, you can't see these characters here because it's too dark on the screen. But I'm going to try to bring this into a Brazilian context and see if you can tell me from some things that some of the folks were saying in this film. They were talking about, sorry, how do I say this?
Nordestino.
Nordestino.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Nordestino dialects, or Nordestino accent.
Yeah.
And these are folks that are Nordestinos living in São Paulo. Yeah. Okay. So when you hear that accent, now of course there's variety, but when you hear it, is there a dominant social indexicality?
Yeah, sure.
And what is that?
Poor,
Black.
Poor, black,
not necessarily
No.
black.
Flat-headed.
yeah, and so Michael and I were saying, oh, that's interesting, because it's like, that's kind of the negative social indexicality stereotypes, prejudice about the south of the U.S.
Yeah.
That's in the north in Brazil, but it's all towards
But
the equator
I
or
would
something.
say
right?
it's even worse.
Yeah, so more,
It's even worse.
yeah.
Because they are the non-qualified workers in Brazil everywhere. So nordestino means almost
Outside, right?
100% someone who comes to do the job that nobody else wants.
Okay. Okay, and is there some multi-indexicality? Are there some positive?
Yeah, they have the best beaches.
Okay, beaches.
They're
friendly.
friendly. Charming.
They dance the forró.
Dance, music, singing,
Yes.
and that creative singing, that kind of back and forth.
Yeah.
You're saying like the origin of rap? You know, rap is
Yeah.
nothing. This is it's incredible.
Repente.
The name of it.
Repente.
Yeah. Thank you.
the food is great.
Oh, and the food is great. Okay, so it's not all negative, right? But there is a dominant social indexical reading that's hierarchical.
It depends if you say Nordeste, which is the place,
Okay.
or Nordestino.
Okay.
First.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
right.
Well said.
Okay, so whether we
Because,
want to
for
go to
example-
the beach or whether we want to go with the people.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
They do not have the same, they have this connotation if considered from a São Paulo point of view. But if you talk about Nordestinos and the Nordeste, they are okay.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, for the tourists, this is the real Brazil.
Authentic, right? Yeah, right. This is authenticity, right. So, and similarly in the South, you want to have, in the U.S., you want to have a Southern accent because you want to be authentic. Authentic look. Okay, so you've mastered social indexicality. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about this idea of direct and indirect social indexicality. And I'm really sorry that these images aren't coming through. Could you,
Yes,
could you
turn
turn
off
off
the
the
light.
front lens, please? Yeah, thank you very much. It's not dark at all on mine, so I'm really surprised here. But so there's a woman, Jane Hill, at University of Arizona, who has talked about mock Spanish humor in the U.S. context. And she sees this as misappropriation. Okay. So we already were talking about caca de toro over there, right? So now any one instance here is just kind of humorous by itself. But Jane Hill, who is a linguistic anthropologist, retired now, who's worked a lot with, she's fluent, she's bilingual in English and Spanish. She's not of Spanish language, culture, heritage, but and she's worked a lot with Nahuatl in folks in Mexico. And she observed with this use of Anglo, but her definition of mock Spanish, it doesn't mean just borrowing language, and it doesn't mean just language play. It's a use of supposed Spanish by superior Anglos, if you will, who don't know any Spanish, who are playing with it, who are being humorous, or being funny. And she says there's a direct indexicality, and there's also an indirect indexicality. And to really understand the humor, you have to understand both. But many Anglo users are only explicitly aware of the direct indexicality. But they are implicitly aware of the indirect. So we'll talk about this for some examples. So these are a bunch of examples, and I'll give some specifics to it. I'm going to give you a little more information than you
I
need.
don't understand this example. What does it mean?
Okay, I can take you through this.
Example.
Okay,
Feliz Navidad para ótimo.
let me explain these, and then I'll take you through some specific examples. Okay, so you get this, right? Bullshit, right?
Yeah,
sure.
Okay, her point here is that this is an office mug. You know, you're walking around the office, now you probably, well, maybe you would now, but in those days, you probably wouldn't be walking around the office in the US context with a mug that says bullshit. But it's okay as a euphemism if it's playful in Spanish. Adios cucaracha, she criticizes the orthography, it doesn't have the accent, and also that it's cucaracha is oftentimes used negatively by Anglos about bugs associating dirtiness with Mexicanness or Mexican Americanness. And this was in a very high-end Anglo neighborhood.
Okay, and what does it mean? Bye,
Oh, goodbye, cockroach. So it's an exterminator company that's going to kill your cockroaches. And it's on a bus. I'll explain this one later. This one is a play on sound. Feliz Navidad, Merry Christmas, with fleas, Navidad. Okay? And then another one is El Cheapo. So this is the English word cheap. This is a liquor store in Marfa, Texas, and you can get cheap liquor here in El Cheapo. So Jane Hill's observation is that mock Spanish really takes on a negative. It's playful, but it's a negative playfulness. So let's look at some examples here. Now this isn't an absolute watertight argument, but there is a lot of evidence for it. Okay. Ignore that. So one strategy or one tactic of misappropriating or misborrowing, inappropriate borrowing of Spanish, is what she calls, in mock Spanish, is semantic pejoration. So you take the meaning of a word that's positive or neutral, and you make it pejorative or negative, insulting. So adios doesn't mean to God or goodbye. It means good riddance, disloyalty. Sorry about that. Hasta la vista, this was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Hasta la vista, baby, right? It doesn't mean catch you later, see you later. It means I'm going to kill you now. Amigo, compadre, etc. Señor, señorita. Doesn't mean friend, closest. It means you're no friend of mine. Okay, amigo, let's go at it. Nada doesn't mean nada. It means worthless or less than. Mañana means laziness, procrastination. So she noticed in collecting many, many examples, she noticed these patterns of negative meaning or negative connotation, but with some humor at play. This is a greeting card, and it was a goodbye card for like a coworker. And it's adios, and then the translation, that's Spanish for sure, go ahead, leave your friends, the only people who really care about you, the ones who would loan you their last dime, give you the shirts off their backs, fine, just take off. So all it is to say, it's a joke. It's an office card given to a coworker who's leaving, who's moving away. and they're saying, adios means disloyalty. We do all this for you, and you're leaving. It's not meant to be offensive. The intended meaning is not at all meant to be negative. It's meant to be playful. Another tactic is euphemism. So caca de toro was one. And you see also loco, casa de pipi, kind of playing with. But also
What's casa de pipi?
a place to go pee, to go to the bathroom, urinal. Okay. And I don't know how to say this in Portuguese. Okay, so Madeleine Albright, when she was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, talked about how the Cuban fighters, air fighters, did not have the cojones to deal with something. And Dave Hill was saying, now who in the world, if this were in English, who in the world would say it would be okay for the ambassador to go on public record, international public record, and say the Cubans don't have the balls to do this? But it's okay to say it in Spanish, but not in English. Now this is tricky because usually if we're using a second or a third or a fourth language, we don't have that same impact. Oftentimes the expression doesn't have that same impact. So in Beijing, for example, you'll see kids walking around with t-shirts that say fuck on them. But it doesn't have that same impact as if they were doing it in the States. You don't have that same kind of resonance. So maybe it felt safe enough, but it's not a coincidence that it was Spanish that was being used. Okay, I'm going to lose time here. Another one is using so-called Spanish morphology. Often that's by adding an O at the end or with L. Or hyper-anglicization, is Americanized, Englishized pronunciation. Feliz Navidad, mucho gracias for a thank you card. So they're playful, right? They're playing on language, they're playing on sound, they're playing on image. So there's this dual indexicality at work here. That the positive is the Anglo, it's like the positive is the Anglo user, who's monolingual, who is, I'm being kind of funny here, I'm clever, aren't I? I have this regional identity of Southern or around Spanish language population. It might mean I even think I'm a little cosmopolitan because I know a little bit of Spanish. It's showing a little bit of knowledge of Spanish. It might mean I'm American. But she says you can only really fully get the humor if you get the negative indirect indexicality towards people who are Spanish language speakers or Spanish language heritage. That they're the object of humor, that they're not serious, so negative qualities, casual, laid back, maybe lazy, maybe vulgar, so the negative connotations. And this goes back to the meta-communication. So there's a split meta-pragmatic awareness. There's a split awareness, overall awareness about this, that users are aware of the positive direct indexicality, but they're not so aware of the indirect indexicality. And so they're feeling, if people are offended, their feeling is, I don't mean anything by it. I'm just being funny. But the question is, can you just say there is no indirect negative indexicality? So intended meaning isn't necessarily the uptake, the received meaning. And that's because the intended meaning is dependent upon this negative as well, whether people are aware of it or not. So this is where we get back to that context, this presupposing established context. You can only get it if you get the negative stereotypes in the US of Spanish language heritage people. That doesn't mean you agree with those, but you can only get it about procrastination about lack of cleanliness, about disloyalty, about vulgarity. And also macro context. This is a history of Spanish being marginalized, of Spanish speakers being marginalized, etc. It also is a creative context. It's contributing to context. That it's creating or perpetuating, strengthening this social and linguistic hierarchy. Now she's saying this is that in the context of the US, it's okay for Anglos to abuse Spanish all they want. But if a Spanish speaker doesn't speak pure standard English, then they are marked. So it's okay for me to, speak lousy Spanish, but if this person has any difficulty with English or an accent, even, it might be perfectly fine English, but it's seen a Spanish accent, then that's marked. And that this builds towards spaces of differential belonging. Who belongs centrally, who belongs more marginally, or now I don't mean for everything to be negative. Sorry, because positive stuff is really a positive thing. When you're talking about the 5 languages, being optimistic, looking for the good and stuff as well. But a part of that, I think, is that if people are well-intentioned, but they don't realize the effect, just like with the Nike ad. So we're getting to the Nike ad. Okay, so the bottom message is that it's not just different interpretations. It's not just my understanding versus your understanding. It's not just my opinion versus your opinion. But it's how meaning works. Meaning is relational. It's not just what's Southern, but it's Southern in relationship to Northern. It's not just Anglo using this, but it's Anglo in relationship in the U.S. context to Latin, or in the Nike ad, U.S. and China. And we have the immediate context, and we have these broader historical, political contexts. And we have issues of hierarchies and power. So one of the things that I'm suggesting is that when we talk about intercultural communication competence, one of the things, whether that's broad international, between national groups, or ethnic groups, or linguistic groups, etc., is to have an indexable competence, to understand this direct or multi-indexicality. But that isn't enough in itself. Understanding it isn't enough in itself, because people can still say, but I still don't mean anything by it. But having that empathy, trying to develop an understanding of why that feels so negative to the Spanish language heritage folks in the U.S. context. Or you have some other examples that I'll use in just a moment. Yes?
Does the author of this book, as part of her research, to go out and talk to native Spanish speakers about their response to these things?
Well, she lives in Tucson, so yeah, so she's worked a lot with, and has done a lot of work in Mexico. But that doesn't mean, again, this multi-indexicality, you're right, I think, and if I'm reading what you're saying, is that it doesn't mean that everybody who has Spanish language heritage in the U.S. context finds mock Spanish offensive.
No, not everybody, but I mean, would that be like a predominant tendency based on some sample of a population, do you think?
Her work was more interpretive, and so it's empirical in that way, but it wasn't empirical in terms of quantitative, like focus group or anything like that, which has been one of the criticisms.
So you really couldn't say that Spanish people in general, or any particular identified subset, in fact find that offensive? Is it her idea
actually,
that people find it offensive?
She found it from ethnographic work that people found it offensive, but you couldn't say empirically that 57% of the people of Spanish language heritage in Tucson, for example.
But she could say a lot of people find this offensive.
Yeah, right, sure. And some people will say, oh, it's just language play. Okay, so let's go back to Chamber of Fear. I promised you we'll see when I would get back to this. So when we think about this, we see that LeBron James, again, he's the chosen one, and he was going against these 5 foes or enemies or fears himself. The problem was, in doing that visually, as he came through each room, he was taking on, they were talking about that synthesis, right, between kung fu films, martial art films, and this video game thing, and basketball. They were taking on important symbols of traditional Chinese culture that were all presented as obstacles to him. The U.S. American, the winner, the U.S. American, who came in on the basketball court and defeated all of these Chinese symbols, which I think he thought was just kind of, let's just blend, right, in its martial arts. What he didn't get is that these were sacred symbols, and that he defeated all of these symbols. I'll show you some photos in a minute. So they were all defeated by him as a foreigner. One was a kung fu master. Another one were the Fei Tian, who are the women that can fly, the special sacred women who fly through the sky. But they were shown not as having these special powers, but as trying to be like these women trying to seduce him. And that was temptation, along with money, US dollars. Mm-hmm. And toward the end, a pair of dragons, which are seen as sacred. So the Kung Fu Master was when he was defeating hype, the Fei Tian was when he was defeating temptation, and the pair of dragons when he was defeating complacency. So, sorry, the ad is online on YouTube, but the quality's not very good, and I don't think it would come through here. So, but here he is defeating the Kung Fu Master. Here are the Fei Tian, who see the dollars. So that's all temptation. They're trying to come at him and tempt him. And he decimates them. He destroys the Kung Fu Master and gets his basket. He destroys the Fei Tian and ends up just carrying them like trash and throwing them away. And he destroys the dragons. He's more powerful than two dragons that are the symbol of Chinese culture.
Oh my God. You have to be pretty dumb.
Well,
you know.
Yeah, right. And you've got Nike behind this. You've got the Shanghai-based ad company behind this. So it wasn't just LeBron James, who was coming from Ohio and Cleveland and didn't really thought he got it and didn't really get it. He was well intentioned. But remember, they said we didn't mean anything offensive, and they don't explain why. It was offensive. Right.
Like Salman Rushdie also didn't mean that.
Right.
Well, I would like to know if the Russians have an ad shooting the eagle.
Right.
The American eagle.
Right.
If people would understand
Texas,
very clearly.
Right. The Texas rattlesnake.
Yeah. Let's hang the eagles.
So, and then there were a bunch of comments on NetEase, the bulletin board. So that it's showing time and again Chinese characters losing. Our country's looking helpless against America. All the Chinese images are defeated, including... Now, to be fair, it wasn't all sacred Chinese images. There was also a scene where he was taking on some black players that looked like they might be, it seemed like they might be African-American U.S. basketball players who had all studied Kung Fu. So they were hard, they were tough, but he took them all on and beat them. And then at the end, the last one was himself, some kind of monster version of himself, which was himself. But the message that came through was, yeah, those don't matter. Look at everything that was Chinese was defeated. So the Western News Report says it didn't specify why, and the indexical readings from these Western News reports is they got that LeBron James was conquering his 5 fears, that his 5 enemies, and they got that most are sacred symbols, but what they didn't get is that was signifying, indirectly indexing, that not only LeBron James, but the U.S. is better than China, more powerful than China. U.S. culture, basketball, is more powerful. And the indirect indexicality is hitting this historical context. A sensitive nerve, a history of U.S. and European imperialism in China, which is still very, very an issue of consciousness, great consciousness. And so this was seen as not creative borrowing, but a misappropriation of these symbols. Now this example might seem kind of self-evident, obvious, but clearly not everybody got it, and the Western News reports didn't get it. And I'm just going to show a couple of other examples here. Okay, so first a summary slide here. So this goes back to some earlier comments today as well.
If you don't do analysis of power relations,
you don't get it, then
You
it's
don't
just
get it.
then it's just different
you don't
interpretations.
get anything ever.
Okay, so all cultures all cultures borrow.
That's how I see it.
So all cultures borrow, right? All cultures are hybrid, all cultures borrow. That's like Father Paolo was saying earlier, you know, I come from this area and we were all being influenced by all kinds of cultural things. What is this purity of culture? So we all borrow, but there are still historical issues of hierarchies, relations to power. And so when is borrowing seen as creative and safe, if you will, respectful? And when is it seen, as in this Nike example, when that borrowing did not work? So we can use for tools to analyze multi-indexicality. We can do what we intend versus what we uptake. This is where we need the empathy, the indexical empathy. Not just understanding, not just the competence, but having an empathy for why that would feel so inappropriate. And if there's a history of oppression or struggle, then who has control over that cultural borrowing? So if we think about, well, what if they had used someone else other than LeBron James? Yao Ming, who is very successful at the same time, basketball player, from China, who played in the States in the NBA. Maybe if they had had him, and that if they had done some sort of blending where the Chinese symbols were working with them, cultural symbols were working with them. Yeah.
It reminds me of certain clients that they make a point that the trainer is the same nationality of the group that they want to train.
Yes, yeah. But it's interesting because they had advertising consultants or designers in Shanghai who were part of this, and you'd think that it would have been self-evident to them too. So we don't know what the process was, right? What the creative, if you will, processes were. This is a common issue in the U.S. context, again, with sports mascots. And so still today in Washington, D.C., the U.S. football team, the Washington Redskins, Native Americans have been protesting use of this label for a very long time, and there still is a refusal to give it up, partly because of money, right? It's the brand. And people have nostalgia, a connection, emotional connection in it, urban fans. But if you compare that with like Southern Illinois sports, the Salukis, there's no cultural offense here, right? So this is a dog that originated, a breed of dog that originated in Egypt. In Southern Illinois is called Little Egypt for historical reasons. I won't go into it. So people will often say, in the case of Illinois, they finally did give up the Fighting Illini and Chief Illiniwek here, but for decades they refused to give it up. So you have an Anglo, a white young man who goes out, he is supposedly in a chief's outfit and dances, which is just doing some kind of gymnastics. And for many of the Native Americans, they were saying this is like having the Pope, somebody dress up like the Pope and kind of just gyrate around at halftime in the basketball club. So it's not just a matter of different interpretations, it has to do with this indexicality. What's the direct indexicality? What's the indirect indexicality? I won't go into more details on that, but I'll use one more example here that seems to work well with my students. Okay, so Halloween is a big holiday, and the U.S. context. Are folks familiar with the U.S.
Yes,
kind of,
yeah.
Version actually doing.
Okay, now on college campuses, and with young folks in particular, it's a time to dress up in costumes and drink a lot of alcohol and get into trouble, basically. But no, it's a big party time. So at Ohio University, a student group got together with this educational campaign that said, you know, we're a culture, we're not a costume. To try to encourage their fellow college students not to dress up in costumes that they found offensive, that are appropriating some kind of representation of that person's heritage. And so this fellow here is apparently Mexican American, and he's saying this is not okay to dress up as you're a white kid here. You're dressed up with, you have the mustache, right? The sombrero, you have the donkey, the serape, etc. And of course you have jeans, no shoes, etc. The shredded jeans. So here we have a Native American saying that this is not okay for these white kids to dress up as Indians.
Elisa,
Yes.
this is interesting because I just said to her, we have carnival in Germany. And
Right,
I
yeah.
want to be a
Native American.
cowboy
Yeah,
or
right,
something.
right. Okay,
This
so
is not at all in this context.
Yeah, I don't
Right,
think this would be seen as offensive in Brazil.
okay.
Because during Carnival, we dress up as everything.
appropriation, right?
So,
Actually, that's what I was thinking. This is not some politically correct.
exactly.
Like it's kind of. I like to wear like a Spanish.
Okay, so and we have multi-indexicality here, but let me just finish a couple more slides and then we'll open it up, okay? So another example is, I'm sorry these slides didn't come through, but an Asian American woman saying it's not okay to dress up as a geisha, as white. And a black woman, African American woman saying, you can't see it here, but she's in blackface. So it's a white person here who's put black on her makeup. And her partner here is pretending to be Dracula, who's going to bite her. Now, interestingly, this campaign triggered a large online response of parody. And I have many examples, but I'm only going to show you one slide with some parody. And so here you have Dracula saying, this isn't okay.
This is who I am and this is not okay.
And here you have a kitten saying it's not okay to have the baby in the kitten outfit. Now, when I work with my students about this, it usually works well because it's in the fall quarter, and so by the time Halloween comes around, we've already been dealing with indexicality, social indexicality. Now, what's the difference here? Is it just playful fun here? It's just different interpretations, different opinions. I didn't mean anything by that. So if we look, sorry.
How would you say this is linked to the political correctness?
Okay, so let's go with indexicality and then we'll connect with political correctness. So some folks would say, oh, that's just political correctness, imposing your view of what's right and wrong on me and what I can do, and restricting my rights to dress in a certain way. But if we think about this, again, back to like the mock Spanish or the Nike ad, the direct indexicality of this person here, the identity, is young white guy, right? American white guy, who's at a Halloween party, who's being funny, who's being creative, funny, and a little naughty. Playing with the boundaries of what's acceptable, which humor often does. Is it okay as a hunter to go out and shoot your fellow hunter to make sure he's dead when you're calling 911? So we're oftentimes dealing with naughtiness, right? A little bit of bad, misbehavior. But to get this, the only way you can get this is if you get a negative, indirect indexicality. That is Mexican Americans being represented as backward, burrowed, using burrows, rural, etc. cetera, et cetera. And that this is reinforcing whiteness, white Anglo over Latino in the US context. And it connects with the historical context in the US. So that's part of the question, you know, with the historical context. Some things, like to dress up as a Nazi in Taiwan, it's hard to get away from global history. You know, sometimes it's more of a local history, sometimes it's more of a global history. Same thing here with Native American. You can't get past genocide and as well incredible poverty of most Native Americans in the States today. And so this is again indexing kind of a foolishness. So there's a direct indexicality, I'm just playing, I'm just having a good time, and indirectly indexing that Native Americans dress funny, are goofy, and oftentimes it's sexualized. There's in Canada, there was a case about dressing as Inuit or Eskimo in this very sexualized Halloween thing, and Inuit were doing like that. So it's seen as misappropriation, inappropriate borrowing. But if we look at this example, well, Dracula doesn't have a history of being oppressed. Well, maybe, I don't know, vampires, maybe we've tried to go out and kill them before. But there's no history here. So this can be funny without having a negative indirect indexicality. So it's not the same, because Dracula has not experienced the same history in the US that Asian Americans have, that African Americans have, that Indians have, Native Americans have. Nor have kittens have had a history of being abused. Well, maybe kids do abuse kittens.
Yes, they do. They do.
Right. But maybe there's less sort of a built-in political hierarchy there. The other thing here is that this campaign, these parodies, actually have an indirect indexicality, back to political correctness, saying, these people. The only way this is funny is if you know this campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has indirect indexicality, saying, these people are just being too damn sensitive. They're being too politically correct. Now, when I work with my undergraduates with it, it's one thing is to get the indexical competence, to understand, first of all, for them to get the different readings is a challenge, but then to develop the indexical empathy, to have some understanding of what that feels like in this representation when people on a day in and day out basis, as well as in these historical contexts, are dealing with this kind of struggle. So I've gone plenty longer than I expected to, sorry.
Do you know what I'm thinking? Have you guys seen how the gringo is represented in Brazil every time you have like carnival? The gringo is always with the camera and flowery shorts, and it's supposed to be funny. Brazilians think gringos look funny.